Okay, so we're here on Daf Nun Alf, correct? I think we got to Esvei Abaye. Is that right? Which is about 8 lines down from the top. Umodaram Gamliel. So Abaye is now asking a question, Rav, and this is all a sugi about Rabbi Gamliel, how to interpret Rabbi Gamliel. Right? Rabbi Gamliel was of the opinion that ain get liachar get and ain maimer achar maimer. And Rav explained it that the whole issue was whether or not the get given to a Yevamot is mafkia nezika, just like a get is mafkia ishus in the case of an h's ish. What do we say? No, the Torah doesn't recognize the power of get, only chalitza. So whereas chalitza could be mafkia nezika and therefore permit her to get married, but get cannot be mafkia nezika. In the case of Maimar, once again, Maimar universally is a Kenyan Kedusha, and it's Kohen, Kesef Ishtar. Or should we say no? Here, in this case of Yevamot, the Torah only recognizes Be'ila and Yibum and not Kesef Ishtar. So, Esvei Abaye, Umoder Ram Gamliel, we have a price that says that Ram Gamliel concedes Yech. There is a validity to a get liachar maimar. So let's say, for example, he gives maimar to Rachel, and then he gives a get to Leah. And this get is valid. What does that mean? It's valid. It generates an iser on the krovos of the miskareshes on the megarish, meaning that once Shimon gives a get to Leah, he can no longer marry Leah's sister, Leah's mother, Leah's daughter, etc. And the same thing is going to apply to Maimar after get. The Maimar liachar, let's say after he gives a get to Rachel, right? Shimon gives a get to Rachel, then he gives a get, then he gives Maimar to Leah. And that means that Rachel is going to require a get together with her chalitza. Why? Because she got a maimar. And then he has a third case here, the get liachar bia. So what does it mean? That let's just read it and then we'll see the diagram maybe. He says, the get achar bia umaimar. So if I understand correctly, there are 3 Yevamos in this case. And one of them he gave a maimar to, the other one he was bia, and the third one was get, all 3. He writes, Shenitna I get, li'achar sheba al tzarasa, ulifnei abia nasan maimar l'tzara cheres. So it was maimar to one Yevama, bia another, and finally get to the third. Now bia obviously in the second Yevama was Kohen. But yet the bia was done after the maimar of one of the other Yevamos. And what happens is that as a result of this maimar, there's like a psul, right? The maimar could not be mafkir the zikas because the Torah doesn't recognize maimar in this case. So if that be the case, then since the maimar, in effect, leaves the yibum, the zikas yibum in place, when he gives a get to the third Yevama, there is validity to that get, which always means that he's also bekrova some its gareshes. The maimar achar bia v'get, and let's say he gave a get to one Yevamot, he gave bia to another one, and now he gives maimar to the third one. So before the bia, he gave a get to the tzara, and the first thing he did was a get, and therefore at that point we say that he's not allowed to be miyabim, and he has to do chalitza. Then he went ahead, violating this law, and he was boil as hashnir. And he's not kona kinyin gomur, he's not mafkir the zika, so that if he gives mimer to the shlichis, that mimer is going to require a get. What do we see clearly from this brisa? What Abai wants to conclude and draw the conclusion for this brisa against Rava, that Rav Gamliel concedes that bia after maimar is considered a bia psula, such that after that bia, if he gives a get to the third Yevamot, that get will be validated. Well, for example, in the case of bia after get, that bia is called a bia psula, so that maimar afterwards is meaningful. The imes safkala, the Rav Gamliel, according to your explanation, Rava, that Rav Gamliel has a suffix, and he vacillates back and forth whether maimar is considered a kinyan, and he's kones the Yevamot, or fakir. In the case of get, just the opposite, it's meaningful and it's effective to be mafkir the zika. Then he shouldn't have said that bia after get and maimar is considered a bia psula, such that whatever he does afterwards would be valid. Because no matter which side in your safed, the maisa after the bia has no significance. It's not effective at all. Why? Because if we're going to say that maimar is kona, so then there was a full-fledged kinyan with maimar, and that was done with the first Yevamot. So it's as if it's tantamount to having bal leha, and it's mafkir the zikas yim. So then, if that be the case, then the bia of the shnia is a bias nus, and the get that's given to the third Yevamot is like a get that's given to some zara, someone who's not related to him at all. There's no zika whatsoever. So it should not generate an isa on our krovos. And even in the case of get, where there was a suffix, just one second, what was the... Right, the suffix of get, where the get is mafkia zikas yibum. So let's assume for one side of that suffix, right, Rava's suffix in Rav Gamliel, namely that the get that's given first is mafkia yibum, which means that the bia subsequent to the get is a bias nus, is therefore the maimar after that bia should not be kona. She should not require a get. Or, for example, on the other side, let's say we'll talk about maimar. Maimar is not kona klal. Is if that be the case, then according to that side, that maimar is not kona. I'm sorry, that maimar is not kona klal, I should say. And the tzad that get is not kona klal, so there's no of course zika sibum. So why are you telling me that after Maimar or after Get, there's no possibility of Yibum? According to your side, in the suffix of Rav Gamliel, there should be, clear sailing for Yibum. There's no Gam in Yibum because neither the Maimar nor the Get was Mafkia the Zikas Yibum. We have a full-fledged Zikas Yibum. Let him be Miyabim. Heavy, Gibir de la Chatchila. In other words, when he has beer with the Shnia after the Get or the Maimer to the Mishona, it should be like beer mitchila, as if he started with beer. Because Maimer and Get are not chal at all in the Yevamot, according to that side. And that Gorea the Kinyan of beer of Yibum afterwards, the Tiknin. And as a result, the beer that's done in the Acherim, in the Yevamot Shnia, let's say, should be Kona, har to the oven. And if he gives a get to the shlichus, that's like a get to a zara, to someone from the street. Why would it generate an isa on the krovos? Or if there's maimer lachreo, it shouldn't be kona. They get all this on the side that bia is kibbut chila, meaning that the maimer is not kona klal and the get is not kona klal and nothing was pogea in the zikas yibum, and therefore the bia is a full-fledged bias yibum. So why should it be such that if he starts with beer, then Maimer and Get afterwards are meaningless? Dasnana be'ila bizman shebitchile nachra klum. And he writes here, Velo chalu kinyan Maimer, o of course Get. And again, that's even though the Get or the Maimer was given first, because we're holding now Kibia de la Chatchil and Einachra Klum. So Einachra Klum, right, is the second half of a whole, right? The first half of is that if there was a mimer or a get beforehand, and then it was via the mimer and the get or not mafkia in Yibu, which is called the Eina Kol Klal. And now the flip side would be, if let's say after the Be'ilah, he would give a mimer or a get, that's also totally invalid. So it's interesting. He points out here when we say that the get is invalid, she can now marry a Kohen. I mean, that's the thought that was always on my mind here, but he says it explicitly. And also, the get of the Ma'ir will not generate an Isa on the Krova. So basically, at this point, it seems that Abaye has completely rejected Rava's explanation. He has to have a new explanation for Rav Gamliel. Begete dochi the maimar de kani. That get is mafkia the zika in such a way. Again, all this is the Rabbanan, obviously, but in such a way that now, if he has a bia after the get, he cannot be kona her because there was no zikas yibum. In Rabbanan, we dissolved and invalidated the zikas yibum. The same thing applies to Maimer. If a man does a Maimer with his Yevamot, Midrabanan, he's Konahar, that's called Dachi. I mean, it's the flip side of Dachi, it's Kanin. And therefore, when he has Bia after the Maimer with a Sarah, he's not Kona Lagaman. Because Maimer was Kona. What does he add over here? Just 1 second. He says, Kevet shenasta achrei get nidchesa me'at miyibum beget v'nechlasha zika. Mokshdasacher maimar farkones sarosa ma'at v'nesra lo liyibum. Yishum she'eno rashoy livno shnei bat. Oh, so right now, basically comes out, again, we're stopping Abai in the middle of a sentence here, so that's not fair, but in the middle of the sentence, Abai is explaining Rabbi Gamliel is identical to the Chachamim. That get is not mafkia and mimer is not kohen. So where is the machlokas between the Chachamim and Rabbi Gamliel? View the Rabbanu would not masakein a takana that the get should be mafkia the zika like chalitza, even though again we're holding out dochi, right? So it means that the get was mafkia the zika of Yibum on a Rabbanu level, but it's not like chalitza, right? Because chalitza is mafkia zika sibum completely on a deraisa level. Again, the get is not mafkia the zika like chalitza. So the mimer is not kona like bia. Omer Rabbanon. So the Rabbanon established through a takana two kinyanim in this tsar. Yevamot. I guess Yevamot here refers to each one of these two Yevamos. Bechad sad mahani beget, ubechad sad mahani be maim. You know, this reminds me of the sugi of Chatzi Eved Chatzi Ben Chor. There's chad sad and chad sad. You know, on the one hand, they were saking that the get is mafkia, this Yevamah from Yibum, but it's only partially so. It's only on chad sad, he says. Ubechad sad mahani ba maimar. And on the other side, so to speak, of the Zika, we're mamish splitting the Zika into two chalakim, so to speak, is they were masaking that the Kinyan Maimer should be Kona, and the entire Kinyan effectuates only a chelik in, I guess, in all the Yevamas. So Zikas Yevama is now being split into two parts. In one part, a get could be tofes. In the other part, a mimer could be tofes. And this is going to be the basis to understanding Rabbi Gamliel. How so? Get, achar get, lo dochi. And Maimar Achamaimar lo kani. What's get achar get lo dachi? The second get cannot be chal to create and generate an isa on the krovos, but daha dacha le kam. Right? The chelik of the zika that was removed by get via the takanas chachamim is already in the first get. He was mafkia that chelik of the Zika. So what does it mean, ein get liachar get? Whatever the first get was meant to accomplish, it makes the second get totally superfluous. Because the first get was mafkia part of the Yibum, part of the Zikas Yibum, and that was already accomplished by the first get. And therefore, on the second half of the Zika, which is the part that the first get was not mafkia, the second get doesn't have any more power to be mafkia than the first. So therefore, the second get is not valid at all, it doesn't register. And the same logic is going to apply to Maimer. Maimer lo kani. Da kani le kama. Right, this is the opposite of the get. The get was mafkia, the zikas ibum bechelko, and now the Maimer on the positive flip side is going to be kona on chelik mimena. Now the second Maimer has nowhere to be chal, because whatever, shall we say, mixas kinyan was chal through the first Maimer, the second Maimer is just repeating. It's identical to the first Maimer. It can't be kona. It's that part of the Zika about which they made a takana that the Maimer should be chal to be kona the Yevamot. It was already achieved, that kinyan, with the first Maimer. And there's no space left over, so to speak, for a second Maimer to be chal. Now you might ask, could the second Maimer be chal on the other half of the Zika? Because we said the Maimer is only chal on half the Zika, so maybe the second Maimer could be chal on the second half of the first. Right, the second half of the Zika after the Maimer Rishon, and he says here, Ein gam koach ha-Maimer hasheni liknos she'olav lo tiknu she'yoel ha-Maimer. In other words, there's a half of a Zika, and the takana excluded that half of the Zika from the kinyan of Maimer. And it's like we're identifying that half of the Zika. So the second Maimer cannot effectuate a kinyan on the second half of the Zika, because that second half of the Zika was specifically singled out, almost like protected with regard to Zikas Yibum. But now let's talk about get li'achar Maimer, or Maimer li'achar get. Oh, this is beautiful, right? The Takonis Chachamim with regard to Maimer was on one hand, and the Takana of get is going to be on the other hand. And therefore, you could have a get li'achar Maimer, Maimer li'achar get, because these two maisim are done on two different halachos. Again, this is very technical. There's a lot of like physics over here, or engineering. I don't know what you want to call it. Hai milsa kadachi. It's the get that's given to the Yevamot is doche. It undermines half of the Zika. The hai milsa kakani. Just 1 second. Again, if we're talking about giving a get to the Yevamot, so there was afkas Zika on part of the Yevamot. Oh, I see. So half of the Yevamot in the case of a get did not lend itself to afkas Zika. So the Zika is still valid, so to speak. It's alive and active in a potential state on half of her. And on that live Zika is Maimer is Konan. Right? Kokoni, meaning the Maimer is Konan on the second chelik. So let's just see what I'm trying to figure out what the repercussions of that would be. So let's say if you have a get, where do we want to start with? Which came first? It doesn't really matter, but let's choose one. Let's say that he gave her a get first to one, let's say to one of the Yevamots. So that get now makes her, since it is mafkia, one chelik of the zika, makes her into megureshes. It's a valid get, and therefore that generates an isra on her kronos. Now, subsequently, he does a mimer on the other hand, because the get did not accomplish a hafkas zika on the other hand, and on that there'll be mimer, which will have repercussions because now she can no longer get married without a get. So she'll need both, well, one of them will need chalitza at least. And then there'll be a requirement of get as well. And you can flip it around the other way. Let's say there was mimer first, and then there was get. So the mimer operates on chilek, and there's still a zika on the other chilek. So the mimer makes her like a Yevamot kibia on half of the zika. There's still another half of the zika that you could be mafkia with a get, which would generate an isra on her kronos. So again, just to summarize, in the case of get liachar get or mimer liachar mimer, the second get, the second mimer doesn't register at all. It has no validity. That's from Gamliel. However, if there'll be mimer and then get, or get and then mimer, then both the get and the mimer will register, each one for its own repercussions, its own nafkaminas. Now, all this is according to Rabbi Gamliel. Now, what do the Chachamim hold? Because the Chachamim say yesh get liachar get, yesh mimer liachar mimer. What do they hold? Rabbanan Savri, kol chad v'chad kinu le Rabbanan. Get, mimer, v'chol Yevamot. Okay, what does this mean? With regard to each one of the Yevamim, that means. Let's see if we can fit it into place here. So with regard to each one of the Yevamim, Rabbanan made a takana that has two parts to it. It has get and maimah. That is b'chol Yevamot. So takinu le Rabbanan get. So that means the get is effective on chelik me'azika, to be mafkia part of the zika. And then there's a takana of maimar to complete the zika, upgrade it to ishus on half of the Yevama. So I'm going to read here the commentary. It says, Kishem sha'maymer ein akone es kol zika sayim ela es chelka gam ein ha'maymer kone ela sachelek sheyesh li yavam zeh b'yavam zu sha'asava maymer. What does that mean? What does that mean? Let's read it again. Ein ha'maymer kone ela es hachelek sheyesh liyavam zeh b'yavam zu I guess what we're doing here is we have a lineup of Yevamis and a lineup of Yevamot, and we're sort of matching them up, so to speak. So, like, each Yavam has a chelek of a Zika in one particular Yavam. Which particular Yavam is that going to be? That's the one that he does Maimar. So the Maimar is going to be Kona chelek of the Yavam, but only vis-a-vis that Yavam and that Yavam. Okay, so that's as far as Maimar is concerned. Now we have to talk about Get. Now we said that the Get is mafkia a chelik of the Zika, but it's not mafkia the other chelik of the Zika. Now, one of the Yevamim gave a get to one of the Yevamis. So with regard to the Zika vis-a-vis that Yavam, there's going to be Avka b'miktas, right, of Chelek, of that Zika to that Yavam who received the get. You see, what's the repercussion here? Al Kain, therefore, Yavam Shasa Maimer B'Yavama, Eino Yochel Lasus Ba Maimer Shenis. He's only given Chelek of the Zika, and that he already exhausted. He doesn't have the ability, the power to be Kona the second half of the Zika Sibu. Okay, so that's number one. Ulam lo poil b'kinyono eliknos es chelik azika sheyesh ba elav lefichach achiv. Okay, now we get to the second yavam. Yochel lasus gam hu maima. Ooh. So both Shimon and Levi gave Maimar to the same Yavam. And Levi's Maimar is going to be valid. Why? Levi's chelek in the Zika is not the same as Shimon's chelek in the Zika. So therefore, even though Shimon did a Maimar, and he was awarded, so to speak, part of the Zika, but nevertheless, there's another part of the Zika that's designated for another brother, for the other Yavam. Yavam zesha asa maimer b'yavama achas, yachol lasos maimer b'tzarasa. Why? Because the miktas Zika that he was Kona in one Yevama has nothing to do with his Zika to a Tzara. And now he can do a Maimer to the Tzara because, again, he gets a certain portion that's allotted to him in the Zika from each one of the Yevamos. So the other Yevamos, they have a chelik haroilo in the Zika, and therefore he can do a Maimar. So again, whether or not Shimon and Levi in sequence both gave a mimer to the same Rachel, or whether or not the same Shimon gave a mimer to both Rachel and Leah, the same dinim apply. Because in the structure that the Chachamim maintain, we're going to divvy up the Chalakim, and they're going to be designated and singled out between the different Yevamis or the different Yevamim. Okay, what are we up to now? He says, Ata, Ba HaGemar Levares Divrei Rav Gamliel Bebraisa Sheyesh Maimar Achar Bia. Okay. Now, what kind of bia are we talking about? So we'll give it A, B, and C. We have get, bia, and maimar. And we're going to say yesh maimar achar bia psula. Why is this a bia psula? Because first he gave a get. I'm assuming again there are two different yevamas. So he gave a get to one yevama. Well, let's say there are three yevamas, maybe. I'm not sure. So he get to one yevama. Now the bia to the second yevama is a bia psula. So it's not mafkia the zika completely, and that leaves room for mimer in the third yevama. Or we can turn it around the other one. Let's say he started with mimer to the first yevama, then there was bia to the second yevama. That bia is a psul because of the first mimer. And then he gave a get to the third yevama. Right, so we're just switching around the sequence. It's always with bia sandwiched in between get and mimer. Either starting with get and ending with mimer, or starting with mimer and ending with get. And what we're saying is that even though bia is kona biyavama, which would mean that if there was a mimer after bia, there's nothing upon which that mimer can be chal, because there already was bia, which is kona biyavama. But high bia psula. But since there was a nesina's get, therefore the bia is a bia psula, or alternatively there was a kinyan maimar. She'ena kona ligamre. So what's she'ena kona ligamre? I think he's saying about the bia psula, that the bia psula is not kona ligamre, which if it would have been kona ligamre would totally block the efficacy, the meaning of the significance of a get or a mimer afterwards. No, we're saying that the bia is a bia psula, because the bia was done after get or after mimer, and a bia psula is not kona ligamre. So even though on a deraisa level he through his bia he's accomplished a full-fledged kinyan yevama, but the Rabbanan said that if this bia is after maimar or get, it's a bia psula, and it's not kona ligamre. That leaves room for a get or a maimar subsequent to the bia. Now, what does it mean? Adifa mi maimar, but griya mi maimar. Adifa. Okay, so the Gemara is going to explain this. Now, again, I'm assuming the word adifa refers to bia. Let's see if I'm right about that. So again, it's a difa mimaimar, and it's more of a kinyan than maimar, but on the other hand, it's griya mimaimar. It doesn't have the power of kinyan that a maimar has. So let's go through these two studies. One side is adifa, that the bia is adifa mimaimar. Why? The ilu maimar maimar lo mahan. Filu bia maimar mahani. Okay, right? So if there's bia after maimar, you're going to need a get because of that bia. And also the bia will generate an isur on hakrovos. Whereas maimar, the second maimar doesn't register at all. And therefore, there's no need for a get to counter the impact of the second maimar. This is all in Rabbi Gamaliel. So biachar maimar mahani, and therefore she'll need a get because of the bia, and there'll be an itzer on her krovos. So what's exactly the chiddush here of biachar maimer mahani? I mean, that's obvious because on a doraisa level, bia is konen yevamot. Oh, I see. In other words, you would have said that maybe the bia is not mahani. Again, this has to do with yesh koch biad chachamim, I guess. I don't know if anybody point that out. But once the chachamim established maimar before bia, that maimar achieves, we said, a kinyan bechelka. Correct? So the Rabbanan consider that maimar as if he was kona har bechelka. And if that be the case, you could have argued that the bia after maimar is designated to be kona that same chelek that the maimar was already achieved a kinyan. So the bia should not be affected. But the answer is that since bia is affected on a doraisa level, the Rabbanan recognize that bia as a kinyan, and it's a greater kinyan than the maimar that came before it. And that's even though, here's the chiddush, that the bia is being koned that same chelek that was designated for the kinyan maimar. But nevertheless, bia adifa mi maimar. So for example, if there was maimar and then bia, a subsequent maimar would not register. Now let's turn it around the flip side. And it's griya mi maimar. And a bia psula is inferior to maimar. Why? Dilu maimar achar haget. Chani lekula shira the get. Right, we said the get was mafkia part of the zika, but there's still part of the zika left. And the maimar after the get is going to be kona that part of the zika that was untouched and was not uprooted by the get. So whatever was left as far as the zika after the get, maimar is going to be kona. So that chelik of the Yevamot, according to this Takanas Chachamim, which was not included in the get, is now designated for maimar, and now the maimar could be kona that half, and therefore, let's say there would be another maimar afterwards, it would be meaningless. The ilu bia, where is bia inferior to maimar? If bia was after the get, lo kanyale lekule shiura the get. Right, we said the get was mafkia half the zika, that chelek, and the other half lends itself, we said before, to maimar. But as far as bia is concerned, the bia will not be chal. What does that mean? Why is it to be a chal and shira the get? Why is it different than maimar? He says, Ein kinyana chal b'chol achelik shetofis kinyan liyava. Okay, here's where I got stuck. I'm trying to figure out why is it, or how is it, that bia is not as great as maimar. It's griya mi maimar. Because we said that there is maimar achar get, and that's called kani lekule shira to get. But bia after get is lo kani lekule the shira to get. What does that mean? Eino kones kol ma shenosar achar get. Klomar ein kinyona chal. B'chol achelik shetafas opinion liyava. Ein kinyona chal b'chol achelik shetofes bo opinion liyava. So again, what happened here? We started with get, then we had bia. What happened afterwards? Are we assuming in the third Yevamot there was maimar? Maybe that's what he means. I don't know if I'm adding too much here. You got to be very careful. She'ein kinyan achal b'chol achelek shetofis bo kinyan liyavam. Oh, here, this is good. Maimar shenasa achrei abia. So again, I think we're talking about get, bia, and then maimar. Is the bia was a bila psula because it came after get, and we're going to assume that the bia is not going to completely cover that part of the zika that's left to block a subsequent maimar. But rather, on the contrary, if after the bia, because again, the bia was a bia psula subsequent to the get, and therefore after the bia, the maimar that's done after bia psula is konen. And what does that mean? It's konen. Number one, it's going to require a get. And number two, it shall be also on his krovos, on her krovos. Oh, if you add here, v'chein biyashe us achrei b'yevamot sefes. So he always has these two scenarios. One is get bia and maimar for the same yavam with the same yavam. And now he has get bia and maimar for three different yavamos. He says, "Kevan shebia she'asach rabbi yavamot sefes kone lesser achegila get the asur b'krovosel achiyiten la get the asur b'krovosel." That's what we have. He has Yitzir Taf Lamed Dalit. We'll read it quickly. He says, Reuven v'Shimon Achim, Nasa Reuven es Sarah, v'es Rivka, v'es Rachel. So Reuven has three wives. Meis Reuven v'lo Banim, so that now Sarah, Rivka, and Rachel fall for Yibam to Shimon. Nasa and Shimon getless Sarah, It's kulon min hayibum min rabbanon. Okay, so that's get. Now, what happens after the get? Achakach yibem es Rivka. So he gave a get to Sarah. Now he's miyabim Rivka. Mina Torah biazu konosa mafkia es kol zikasayim. Ach, became it should biazu psula. Sharei get. So again, we're talking about bia to Rivka, but the get was given to Sarah. Is therefore oser. That get is oser's kulam l'syamin. So the bia to Rivka is called the bia psul because he had already given a get to Sarah. Is yesh achreha klum? What does that mean? Yesh achreha klum. Hainu shem yasa maimar berachel. Rachel is number 3. Titztarech mimenu get. She'll need a get. The aser b'kromosel. He can no longer marry the krovos of number 3. What was her name? Rachel, I think. Right? The ein omrim shekonsa bia as kol chelak azika shelo nifka beget mishum bia psula grua mi maimar. Enokones kol azik. All right, he doesn't go into detail about grua mi maimar that we saw before. The ilu maimar kani lekula shir to get. So if there was mimer after the get, then that mimer is kona everything that's left over, so to speak, and therefore there won't be any mimer after that mimer. But in this case, there was a get, and then there was mimer, and then finally, there was get, and then bia, and then finally mimer. So the bia is a bila psula, it's grua mi mimer. The eno kona es kol azika. And therefore, there's a possibility of a maimar after the get. Okay, then, so that's where we'll stop for today. And we're up to Rabbanan. Let's see if you can make a note here where we got up to. Tan Rabbanan Ketzad Amar Rav Gamaliel. And tomorrow's what, Tuesday? Yeah. Okay, we're plowing through this, trying the best we can.